Hey everybody. Today we have our last lecture. We're going to be talking about managing our waste. All right, give me a second here. Okay, let's get started. So waste is any unwanted material, any substance that results from things we do that as humans. But we can divide that waste into several different categories. First, what you probably think of when I say waste is all of the trash, that non-liquid waste that we are producing from our homes, our schools, other institutions, and small businesses. So, in general, when you think of waste, this is what you're thinking about here. It's municipal solid waste. We also have industrial solid waste. And industrial solid waste is anything that it comes from the production of consumer goods and um, industrial industries. So things like mining, agriculture, petroleum extraction, all of these large corporations, the solid waste that they produce, we call industrial solid waste. And it's regulated slightly differently, which we will get to a little bit later on here. And then finally, the next category we are going to talk about today is hazardous waste. So any of that solid or liquid waste that we can't simply throw away because it might be toxic to the environment. That is all called hazardous waste, and that has to be um, disposed of in a very different way than our other two. So our topic today is managing our waste, and there are three major ways that we can do this. Three ways that we can regulate the amount of waste that we personally are generating. First off, we can minimize the amount of waste that we produce. So this is one of the most important ones because if we can simply minimize the amount of waste that we are producing, we are directly reducing what is making its way to a landfill. We can also recover materials that we might normally be throwing away and find new ways to use them or at least recycle them. So we can recover discarded materials. And then finally, not everything is able to be recycled and recovered, obviously. So some waste must make its way to these landfills and waste facilities. So the last thing that we can do to um, manage our waste is to dispose of our waste properly, safely, and effectively. So when we talk about managing our waste, I'm going to refer to the something called the waste stream as we go forward here. And the waste stream is the flow of waste as it moves from its source, so wherever it's produced, all the way toward where it's disposed of. In this case here, a landfill. So this is the waste stream. Normally, anything that's produced eventually is going to flow down this waste stream, make its way to a landfill. And one of the most important ways that we can minimize the waste that we produce is by what we call source reduction, minimizing waste at its source. So all the way up here at the top of the waste stream. This is the best way of minimizing um, waste production because we're reducing it at its source. So it doesn't even have a chance to make its way down to these landfills. We don't even need to worry about recycling or reusing these materials because we're minimizing waste at the source here. So we'll blow this up a little bit so we can take a look at many of these steps here to reduce the waste that we're producing. So these ones up here on the top would be what we call that source reduction of waste. And a lot of this falls on industry because if we can better our industrial practices, make them more efficient, we're going to produce less waste overall. So we won't even need to worry about things like composting, recycling, if industries simply improve their efficiency and produce less waste. We can also minimize packaging. And this is a huge one. This is a big pet peeve of mine. You've all seen it at a store. Um, Ridiculous packaging that just simply doesn't make sense for the product. So for a moment here, we're going to focus on this one, source reduction in the form of minimizing packaging. And I just have some examples here to kind of stress this point. Because again, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine. So I have examples here of some pointless packaging. First up here, we have one book of stamps. So this person ordered a single book of stamps, and for some reason, it had to be shipped with all of this padding, this large cardboard box, just for one simple book of stamps that could have easily fit into an envelope or something simpler. Next up, we have one single tablet of Claritin. So this is what we want right here, right? In order to get this though, it needs to be packaged in foil and plastic. That again needs to be wrapped in more plastic. And then this plastic container needs to be put in cardboard and even more plastic with all of this labeling printed on the cover. So you can see this just simply doesn't make sense for one tablet of Claritin. Next up, we have a little bit of makeup ordered from Sephora. You can see we have one little package here that again was shipped with multiple layers of insulation and padding, as well as a large Sephora box. You can see the scissors for sale. So this doesn't make any sense for this small little container here. Here we have someone who ordered, looks like 5 or 6 ink cartridges for their printer. And instead of packaging these all up into one box, these were shipped in 6 separate boxes, all going to the same location. So if we can minimize things like this at the source, we won't have this waste to deal with at all in the first place. So that's going to be the best bet we have for reducing waste here in the United States. One of the biggest culprits for packaging like this is toys. So here you could see some tiny little plastic toys that this parent bought for their child. The toys are up here in this green box. All of the packaging and trash, this is stuff that can't even be recycled, just has to make its way straight to the landfill. It's all down here in the red box. So these are, you can see, pretty cheap plastic toys anyway. These are the type of toys that probably aren't going to last a whole lot of time, but this waste that is generated is going to last a very long time in our landfill. So next up we have bananas. And bananas already come in their own private packaging in the peel. So this drives me completely crazy when I see this at a grocery store. Don't need to individually pack bananas like this with cling wrap, styrofoam. This is just completely pointless waste that we can't recycle. It's going to make its way to a landfill for absolutely no reason. These little sausages have all been wrapped in their individual plastic wrappers, which again doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the last one here I have for you is a single strawberry that you can see not only requires refrigeration, which is going to use excess energy. We have this single strawberry packed in foam. We have some other waste material here, cardboard. The whole thing is wrapped in plastic wrap. And then the icing on the cake here is that this single strawberry is freshly shipped from Japan by air. So all of these single strawberries wrapped in all of this packing material also are shipped by plane, which, as we know, is a huge contributor to climate change, global warming, and increasing the greenhouse gases here on Earth. This doesn't make any sense at all. If we can avoid things like this at the source, we simply wouldn't have to deal with this waste that, at least to me, seems completely frivolous, doesn't make much sense for a single strawberry. So as I said, generally, when you think of trash, garbage, you are thinking of what we call municipal solid waste. Those are things like metal, plastic, yard trimmings, food scraps, paper, all the things that we're normally throwing away every day in our homes, in our small businesses, at our schools, etc. And the majority of this waste comes from things that don't even need to be um, shipped to a landfill. So things like paper, plastic, yard trimmings, food scraps, all of these you can see make up the majority, especially paper. Paper is the biggest waste product that we produce here in the United States. A lot of this paper, though, could be recycled. Some of it could potentially be composted. Along with these food scraps, the majority could probably be composted as well, along with the yard trimmings. So the majority of these two sections don't even need to get to the landfill at all. They could be composted, converted into organic matter that we can then reuse to produce even more food. And then the things like plastics, metals, and paper, most of these can be recycled. So the majority of this doesn't even need to make its way to the landfill in the first place, but unfortunately, um, it does. So since the 1960s, we have generated a lot more waste here in the United States. So this graph represents the total waste generation that you can see in blue in the United States, and then per capita. So this is waste generated per person per day. So you can see since the 60s, we have seen a increase in per capita waste generation. So if we combine this with the increasing population, we have seen our total waste generation in the US nearly triple since the 60s. So we're producing a lot more waste than we once were, partly because we are becoming more and more affluent, generating more waste per person, but also because our population is increasing, so we have more people to generate the waste in the first place. But the United States isn't the only one with a waste problem in the world. This is a huge problem, especially for developing nations. Because in developing nations, people are again becoming more and more affluent. You might remember that demographic transition, the 3 steps that we went over early on. Those nations that are in that developing stage, where populations are becoming more and more wealthy, more and more affluent, they have they're able to purchase and have access to more and more consumer goods. We see a huge boost in waste production in these countries. And these countries, unlike fully developed countries, just don't have the infrastructure to deal with the increasing waste. So we tend to see the worst problems with waste generation in those developing nations. Developed countries still are producing a ton of waste, but in developed nations like here in the US, we have improved our waste collection and our waste disposal a lot more than developing nations. So the proportion of waste entering landfills tends to decline as a nation develops, because we see an increase in recycling programs, an increase in composting. So you can see here in this sort of orange peach color, although we see an increase in materials entering landfills, we see it somewhat level off in the 80s. And this is because we have a huge boost in both recycling and composting here in the United States. So although we're still generating a ton of waste, more and more as we improve the infrastructure for these things, more and more things are getting recycled and composted, which is good news. As I said, though, in order to reduce waste generation at its source, packaging is a really easy thing that we can target. So packaging is a huge source of waste that can be pretty easily reduced. And as consumers, although we don't have direct control of these things, we can, again, the idea of voting with your dollar comes into play here. So we can buy things like unwrapped produce. We can buy food in bulk, so there's even less packaging. So look for those things with less packaging to show these corporations that, hey, we don't want to buy things that are completely wrapped in plastic. Don't buy single bananas that are wrapped in cling wrap, sitting on a styrofoam container. There's no reason for that. A lot of this, though, falls on the manufacturers. So manufacturers need to switch to packaging that can either at least be recycled, but preferably we need to reduce the amount of packaging that we use in our products. So reducing the size and weight of containers. And some governments are doing a good job at this. They're taxing and restricting the use of certain types of packaging. In Chicago, there's actually a tax on plastic shopping bags because shopping bags are, again, a huge source of waste. We use a ton of plastic shopping bags in the United States, and they persist for a long, long time, often end up being littered, not even getting to landfill. So here are some everyday things that we can all do to reduce our waste and reuse certain items so they don't end up in a landfill. And again, a lot of these things, unfortunately, aren't especially applicable at the moment, but in general, these are things that we can do long-term to promote recycling and the reduction of waste getting to a landfill. So we can donate items to charity. We can reuse things like boxes. So if you're ordering things from Amazon or other companies, you're always getting tons of cardboard. If we can find a way to reuse those boxes, reuse the paper, plastic wrap, packaging that we receive, that is going to go a long way making sure that these things don't end up in the landfill. Renting and borrowing or lending is another step in the right direction. Bringing reusable cloth bags when you're shopping is a big one. Don't do that right now, but you can leave those in your car. Bring your groceries to your car, then put them in the cloth bags. Bringing your own coffee cup or your own water bottle places is a huge step in the right direction. This is an easy one that everybody can do to help reduce the amount of paper and plastic making its way to our landfills. Rechargeable battery technology has greatly improved in the last 10 years or so. So I encourage you, if you're going out, you need things like AA, AAA batteries. Spend a few dollars extra to get the rechargeable ones. It's going to last you a long time and make sure that that hazardous waste isn't going to make our way to a landfill. All right, so I have a little video here that's going to talk about waste reduction. If you give me just a second here.
MIT is known for developing a lot of impressive technology. But hidden in the kitchen of MIT's Media Lab is perhaps my favorite MIT invention, the food cam. Okay, so it might not look like much, but it's actually quite brilliant. Let's say you have some leftover food. You put it under the camera and you hit the button. FoodCam posts a photo to Twitter, Slack, and a mailing list. All with a simple message: come and get it.
It looks like a pretty good box of donuts. Yes. It looks yummy on FoodCam.
It does. Getting the food can actually be pretty competitive.
By the time we got here, just 30 seconds after it was placed, the whole building has swarmed and all the pizza was gone.
There's a mad rush of people that come from like every entryway in here to get the pizza.
So you got to kind of move pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's a game. It's like the Hunger Games.
Where do you...
Will and John invented the food cam all the way back in 1999. This is before Facebook, before Gmail, before social media as we know it. The idea came from a building-wide leftovers problem, and in some ways, this simple invention gets at the big problem of food waste.
I mean, that's sort of the serious part of what you have done, really, right? Which
There
is a
is
huge
no doubt that this completely helps reduce food waste at the lab.
Almost all of the catering people know that if they have spare food from their event, they can just hit the button and people will consume that food. And those are not even Media Lab events that are now fueling the food cam.
When we picture the stuff that's hurting our planet, what do we think of? We think of like smokestacks, cars, oil spills. We don't really think about all the food we throw away. In the US, roughly 40% of the food we produce never gets eaten. That's over 365 million pounds of food each day. While that's happening, about 1 in 8 Americans still don't have a steady supply of food to their tables. And all this wasted food is a huge contributor to climate change. If global food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, just behind China and the United States. So it really is an enormous problem and one of the easiest ways to address climate change. It takes a ton of resources to produce food. On top of that, you have all the energy it takes to keep it cold and to transport it around the country. And when food decomposes, it isn't just stinky, it releases potent greenhouse gases. Basically, we're trashing our planet to grow food that no one eats. But here's the thing, no one actually likes wasting food. It's just something that we haven't been paying much attention to.
Of all of the challenging problems out there, reducing the amount of food we're wasting is one of the easiest.
In the US, consumers collectively make up the largest portion of food waste. A family of 4 spends about $1,500 on food that they never eat.
Meat is less as a percentage of what we buy, but when you consider it in particular as a greenhouse gas intensive product, meat waste actually has the highest greenhouse gas impact.
And you don't have to be an expert to understand why food is going to waste in our homes. We're all busy and on the go. Sometimes I buy food without thinking, do I really need that?
There's even been a little bit of research to show that once something goes in the refrigerator, it's actually worth less to us than before.
Researchers asked people how they would feel if they got home from the grocery store and dropped a carton of eggs.
And then they asked, well, if your eggs sat in your refrigerator for 6 weeks and then you didn't use them, how would you feel about that? And people felt a lot less remorse. I think a lot of the waste in our society does come down to choice and wanting to have the option to eat something at any time, whether or not we use it.
Part of the reason why we overbuy food is that we've got tons of space to store it in. Refrigerators have grown about 15% since the 1970s.
One of the things we found in our research is that people are uncomfortable with white space when it comes to food. So we love it in buildings or in design, but when it comes to food, we do not want to see empty space in our refrigerators, on our plates. And so I really believe that in some subliminal way, we're just filling everything. And if we had smaller refrigerators that let us see everything that was in there, that in itself would lead to quite a bit less waste in our homes.
And it isn't just our refrigerators that have gotten bigger. The average dinner plate has grown by 36% since 1960. And when you have a big plate, you tend to put a lot of food on it, whether or not you can eat it all. This is something Jill Horst noticed at UC Santa Barbara.
You have a tray that's 14 by 18 inches and you feel you need to load it up with food. You would see students that had 4 glasses, water, juice, soda, milk, and you would go to the tray return and they would still be full.
In 2009, the dining hall stopped using trays. Students can take as much food as they want, but there isn't a tray to pile it onto.
The food waste per person, per tray, reduced by 50%. I mean, so that was huge.
Let's say that the average student weighs 6 ounces of food per meal. That may not seem like a lot, but UC Santa Barbara serves 13,000 meals per day, so that's nearly 5,000 pounds of wasted food. It's like throwing 350 Thanksgiving turkeys into the garbage every single day.
And when you take the trays away and it becomes 3 ounces, that's a significant impact to help with not only the food waste, but food cost.
So it turns out that something very small, like removing a tray or changing the size of a plate, can have this profound impact on our behavior. And it doesn't take much effort because the effect is subliminal. The other thing they're paying attention to at UC Santa Barbara is portion size.
Each plate is portioned, 1 portion for a student
They could take as many portions as they would like, but we are actually plating the right size, the right amount that we should be eating.
We've gotten used to these gigantic portion sizes at restaurants, and in a subtle way, it encourages us to overeat and throw away a lot of food.
If you look around, there's not a whole lot of food waste on the plates because of the proper portioning. I mean, that's somebody's meal. That's all they have left.
None of us are perfect, and wasting less food isn't just going to happen overnight. But just having it on our radar can really help us waste a lot less. And if we do have extra food, then let's at least try to get it to people who could use it.
There is so much high quality surplus that's wasted that just needs to find the people that need it the most.
Komal is the founder of Copia, a startup that's trying to recover all this perfectly good food.
If you imagine the world's largest football stadium filled to its absolute brim, that's how much food goes wasted every single day in America. And I'm not talking about last night's pad thai or this morning's half-eaten pastries, but untouched, uneaten, perfectly edible food.
So we don't need to purchase or make more food. We just need to figure out how to get it to the people who need it. MIT's Food Cam is great at recovering food, but when you start scaling this up from one building to an entire city or an entire country, it becomes much more difficult. Let's say you're a small company and you have 200 sandwiches left over from an event. That's a lot of food, but it takes time and effort to figure out how and where to donate it. Most people really don't want to deal with all of this.
It shouldn't be this hard to do a good thing. Like, how cool would it be if people who have food could say, hey, we have food, and people who need food could say, hey, we need food, and we could connect these two people and clear the marketplace.
So Komal is trying to make food donation easy and intuitive. If you have some food, you type your info into the Copia app. A driver will then come and pick up your food and deliver it to the shelters that need it. And during big events like Super Bowl 50, there's a ton of extra food. The issue is that it has a short shelf life.
Imagine 4 16-foot refrigerated trucks filled to their absolute brim. That's how much food we recovered. We fed 23,000 people in 2 days. Nobody slept. And it's not, hot dogs and popcorn. It was lobster rolls and pulled pork sandwiches and $300 cheeses, high quality food.
If we can get the food that would otherwise be wasted to people who need it, we're not only fighting hunger, but we are actually slowing global warming. It really is a win-win. And Komal doesn't want to solve hunger in just California. She wants to solve world hunger, period.
It's not about optimism or pessimism. I think it's just that we're hell-bent on making it happen. This isn't going to be an overnight thing. It's got to be policy change. It's going to be other entrepreneurs. It's going to be really big companies and institutions also taking a stand and saying that, you know what, we don't tolerate perfectly great food being wasted.
Look, no one likes throwing out food. So we've made a simple guide to help you waste less. To find out more, go to climate.universityofcalifornia.edu.
All right. So the last example there, that company Copia, who's trying to come up with a better way to find a use for the food we're not eating, is a good example for a company trying to address the issue with cradle-to-grave disposal. And cradle-to-grave disposal is that linear movement of products from where they're manufactured straight to the landfill. So we call this cradle-to-grave because they're born at the manufacturer and they move to their grave, or the landfill in this case. In a cradle-to-cradle approach, though, we are taking materials and we're recovering those unused, or we're reusing those products in some way. So instead of going cradle to grave, they are finding a new home and moving again to another cradle, so cradle to cradle. And the two main ways at least that we can do this is by recycling and composting. So these are very important steps for waste recovery. And each of these, recycling and composting, are considered recovery because we are removing waste from the waste stream. So composting is taking any organic waste. So organic waste is things like food scraps, yard debris, wood chips, things like this, and converting that into mulch or humus that we can then reuse. So by composting, we convert organic waste into organic material that can be used again by plants and actually be used to produce even more food. And this is possible because of all of those natural bacteria and other decomposers that convert this organic matter into a material that is then usable by another generation of life. So this is composting. Recycling, we all know what recycling is. I'm not going to define that for you, but you might not know exactly how this process works, so we'll go over that briefly here. So the first step in recycling is to collect and process those goods. So collection is primarily done from either drop-off locations, so if you don't have a recycling program at your house or apartment, there are many locations dotted throughout the country that you can take your recyclables, drop them off for free of charge. So if you don't have a recycling facility, if you don't have a recycling program that you are capable of using where you live, I suggest looking into some of these drop-off locations because you can still do a lot of good. You can recycle even if you don't have access to curbside pickup. Most locations, though, do have access to curbside recycling. So those are the blue bins you see outside of houses. And once that material is picked up, it makes its way to MRFs, or materials recovery facilities. And these facilities are where human workers and machines separate items by weight, size, and material type, so they can be eventually shipped off and converted again into new goods. So after it's sorted, these materials are shipped out to various facilities, so hopefully they can be reused. So here we have recycling rates for all 50 states here in the United States. And primarily looking at this, you'll notice a lot of red, orange, and yellow. And anywhere you see red is indicating a state that does a really poor job at recycling. These are states that have a 0 to 10% recycling rate. So these are very, very low. And unfortunately here in Illinois, we are one of those states who does a very poor job at recycling. And this is partly due to lack of education on how to recycle, but primarily due to infrastructure and policy that just doesn't promote recycling enough. We don't do a good enough job. We're not making recycling a priority here in Illinois. The West Coast tends to be the best at recycling. California in particular does a great job at recycling, and the Pacific Northwest as well. So here, just to refresh your memory here, I have some guidelines on how to recycle here in Illinois. Specifically, this is a recycling guide for Chicago. Because we can't recycle everything. We can recycle some glass, metal, paper, and plastic, but not all of it. So in general, glass bottles, aluminum cans, jars can all be recycled. Tin cans, soup cans, if you buy canned vegetables, any canned goods typically can be recycled as well. The biggest thing here, though, is that make sure when you're recycling things that you are cleaning out these containers. I mean, they don't need to be spotless. You're not going to be eating or drinking from these containers, but the less food material that can get into our recycling, the more likely it is that those materials are actually going to be able to be recycled and reused down the line. If a batch of recycling is too contaminated with either food particles or too contaminated with materials that can't be recycled, unfortunately, most of that material is going to make its way to a landfill. So you can see you can recycle any paper products that are free of metallic ink or glitter. Paper packaging, for the most part, is safe to recycle. Cardboard, as long as it's not contaminated with food. Plastic bottles, plastic tubs, can all be recycled. The things that cannot be recycled that you have to keep an eye out for are glass other than bottles and jars. So things like light bulbs can't be recycled normally. Any oven-safe glass, for the most part, you can't recycle that normally, unfortunately. Electronics, you have to be really careful about recycling. There can be some hazardous material that can break down and leach its way into the environment with electronics, so be aware of that. Cardboard. So this is a big one that trips people up sometimes. So things like pizza boxes. The problem here is the grease. So any cardboard that has been contaminated by food, unfortunately, should make its way into the garbage, not recycling. Same thing with napkins. Any paper products like that need to make their way into the waste bin as opposed to recycling. The thing that trips people up here, though, is things like paper coffee cups. You'd think that these can be recycled, but fortunately, most places, they have a waxy coating that is no good for recycling facilities. So things like your Starbucks coffee cup actually can't make its way to the recycling bin. So when you're recycling things like this, the plastic lid definitely can be recycled, but this paper cup cannot be. So make sure you're aware of that. If you're ordering a coffee from somewhere, throw the cup into the trash, throw that plastic lid into the recycling bin. And then plastic bags, of course, are a big no. That's why, in general, all of these recyclables that you are throwing into the bin should be dry, should be clean, empty, and should not be bagged. Unless you are in a special situation where your recycling facility requires things to be bagged. In general, plastic bags are not recyclable, so your recyclables should be kept bagless. Styrofoam and plastic cups as well. These things that you're generally getting from takeout food, unfortunately, cannot be recycled. That's why many places are moving toward plastic containers to package food, so they can actually be recycled instead of making their way to a landfill. So this is a good place to look if you are not sure whether or not you can recycle something. But certain counties, certain municipalities have their own rules for this stuff. So I encourage you to investigate your own local municipality and find out rules on recycling that are specific to you. Getting back to the basics is important. All bottles, cans, paper, cardboard in general can be recycled as long as it's clean. So keep food and liquids out. That means rinse off your containers. It's an extra minute or so that will make a big difference in the long run. So if you're putting a bunch of contaminated plastic, contaminated cardboard into recyclables, unfortunately, in many cases, that whole batch is going to make its way to a landfill. And then, of course, put those recyclables directly into your bin. Do not bag them. And I have another short video here that talks a little bit more about recycling.
I've been driving for Waste Management for 25 years. This is Christmas tree, propane, and plastics bag. It's not recyclable.
Only bottles, cans, paper, and cardboard go in the recycle bin. Some recycling programs have over 25% contamination. We spend too much time sorting through contamination and not enough time sorting through good material to help the environment.
The oddest thing I'd have seen was a skinned deer.
I saw a badger dead with his eyes open and it terrified me. I thought it was gonna wake up, so I didn't touch that one.
The most common thing that I would see contaminated line would be Christmas lights.
Water hoses that stop the stars from spinning around. And anytime we get jammed, the whole system shut down. Right now, as you can see, everything is shut down because we have to clean the machine.
There's a lot of plastic bags that we get through the system. Grocery bags, bags filled with leaves, that's also get caught up in the screens.
Stream cleaning is when we go inside the stream and we take out the unwanted material, old clothing, old shoes, metal material.
When we go inside the screens, you might have a pole sticking out the shaft. We have to pry it out, or we might have cords that's wrapped around 3 shafts, or ropes, or chains, and we have to use the tools to get those things out. The tools we have is a hook knife, some wire cutters, and some pliers.
6 times a day, we stop the machines to clean for contamination.
Well, it would probably take us up to 2 hours to clean the screen out when recycling is not done properly.
We try to clean the screen 100% so it can run smooth as possible without causing any jam.
Now that I work here at Waste Management, I tell my friend that recycling is really important. If more people would recycle right, we could process more recycling a day.
So hopefully that helps convince you a little bit to try to recycle properly. You might think if you're in doubt if something should be recycled or not, that it's better just to recycle it because, hey, someone down the line will deal with this and decide whether or not it should be recycled. But that's not dangerous, but that's not exactly the type of thinking that we should have. We should make an effort to recycle properly. If in doubt, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's best just to throw it out. Okay. So unfortunately, we can't recycle, we can't compost everything. Some waste is going to have to make its way to a landfill. And at these landfills, we tend to bury waste in the ground or pile it up in large layered mounds to help prevent that waste from contaminating the environment. That's the goal of a landfill, to keep that trash, all of that waste in a single localized place so we can avoid environmental contamination. And there are strict guidelines for how this is done. The EPA, so this is all federally, our municipal waste is all federally regulated by the EPA. There are strict guidelines for how these things need to be handled. And this is a result of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act back in 1976. So for the last 25 years or so, oops, sorry, I think I had a mic issue right there. So sorry about that. So since 1976, we have been regulating, had really strict regulations on how we handle our municipal waste. And this is the general layout of one of these landfill facilities. We layer in our waste and we put in layers of soil to help speed up decomposition, help protect that waste from access by pests. It helps reduce odor. And importantly, soil is what contains all that beneficial bacteria, all those natural detritivores and decomposers that are going to help speed up this process and help break down all of the waste contained here. So this layering is very important. You'll also notice this layer of plastic or another material lining this whole facility here. And this helps to prevent liquid leachate from escaping to nearby groundwater. It helps protect the surrounding environment so that anything hazardous or any of the nasty material that might be in this landfill can't make its way into our groundwater or into the surrounding environment. It's very important. That's why we can't just have a landfill in any old area. This has to be a highly regulated facility, has to adhere to strict guidelines in order for this waste to be disposed of properly. Once we have completely filled up a landfill, we cover it again with soil. And we tend to convert these areas into natural lands or places that can then be used again by humans. So this is what landfill looked like at one point when it was active. Few years later, though, after we have completely covered all of this trash with a thick layer of soil, allowed plants to regrow, now this is what the landfill looks like. It's converted to a natural area where people can go hike, appreciate nature a little bit, and little do a lot of these people know, but there is a lot of trash just 6 to 10 feet under their feet. So some of our trash that doesn't make its way, this is again, we're still talking about our municipal waste here. Some of our trash, we, instead of making its way directly to a landfill, we incinerate first. And incineration is when we take some of that trash and we burn it at a very, very high temperature. And the main goal here is to reduce the volume of our waste. So we take a huge, many truckfuls, and we burn that waste and convert it to things like ash and wastewater, which takes up a lot less space. Now, obviously, there are problems associated with this. All of this waste that we're burning, eventually, we are going to have a lot of gaseous waste in the form of greenhouse gases that is going to make its way to the atmosphere. So this is not an ideal system, but in some cases, depending on what type of waste we have, we can reduce its volume and, in some cases, get some energy out of it. So instead of just burning this material, letting the gas just go straight into the atmosphere, we can use one of these facilities just like we would use a coal-fired power plant. So we can burn this waste. We can use the heat generated to heat up water. As that water is converted to steam, again, just like we do with most of our other ways we generate electricity. As this water is converted to steam, it helps to spin a turbine, which can generate electricity. So most of these incinerators now, we are what we call waste to energy facilities. So we use that heat produced to boil water, to create steam that helps to drive the generation of electricity. So we can actually get some electricity out of this waste that we're incinerating. So again, not a perfect scenario. We're still emitting greenhouse gases, but at least we can get a little bit of energy from incinerating this waste. So it's not a complete waste. Some areas actually take this one step further, and that way all of those greenhouse gases that are emitted after incinerating the waste, in some cases we can harness that gas and again use that to generate even more electricity. So 50% of the gas that's coming out of these incinerators tends to be methane. Methane is basically natural gas, so methane is something that we can use to create even more electricity. So although I'm not advocating the incineration of all of our waste, in some cases in a highly controlled setting, we can get some benefit out of this. We can reduce the volume of that waste and get some basically biogas out of it that we can use to generate even more electricity. So that is municipal solid waste. Everything that you think of as trash that we are generating every day in our homes. Next thing we're going to cover is industrial solid waste. And this is the type of waste that comes from things like factories, these large corporations, large manufacturing plants, things like mining activities, agriculture, extraction of oil. All of these corporations are producing industrial solid waste. And in general, we use similar strategies for dealing with this waste as compared to our municipal waste. Big difference, though, with industrial waste is that it is not regulated by the federal government. So municipal solid waste, the waste that we are generating, me and you, in our homes, is regulated by the EPA. So all states need to follow similar strategies for dealing with their municipal solid waste. Industrial solid waste, though, is regulated by state and local governments. So depending on where these corporations are located, they could have a lot less strict regulations for dealing with their waste. And since many of these industries are based on economic efficiency as opposed to physical efficiency, where we produce less waste, these industries tend to generate a lot more waste and deal with it in ways that aren't as beneficial environmentally. In response to this, certain industries are moving towards what we refer to as industrial ecology. And in industrial ecology, we're seeking to make these industries more sustainable and to function more like ecological systems. So in ecological systems, organisms are using all of the energy and materials that are produced. So if industries think more like ecological systems, we can make use of all of those waste products. So hopefully they don't go straight into a landfill. We can find other uses for them. And one example of this is in the brewing industry. So if you drink beer, many of these big beer brewing processes produce a lot of waste in the form of wastewater, the grain that they use to produce the beer. And in most cases, this goes straight into landfills, but many beer industries are rethinking their methods and trying to make use of these waste products. So here's the traditional brewing process. Start with grain and water. And this is heated up, boiled, converted into beer. And then we have all of that grain that has been boiled up is, for the most part, sent off to the landfill, or some of it may be used for animal feed. But spent grain, along with wastewater, for the most part, in the traditional process, just makes its way into the trash. Some breweries, though, now are, instead of taking their spent grain and wastewater and putting it into a landfill, are using their spent grain to do things like make bread, act as a substrate for growing mushrooms, and those mushrooms can be sold as food. We can then take that substrate and it can be used as animal feed, so we can do things like feed pigs. The waste from those pigs or other animals can actually be used as well, either directly as fertilizer for algae in fish ponds, or we can put them into what we call a digester and get biogas, which then we can use to convert to energy. So this is a great way at taking this waste, removing it from the waste stream, and reusing it to create other products. So this is an example of industrial ecology. We're thinking of these systems as ecological systems. We want to make use of all the products we can, so as little as possible becomes waste and makes its way into these landfills. The last form of waste we are going to touch on here is hazardous waste. And hazardous waste is all of that stuff that we can't just throw away. So some hazardous waste may be ignitable. At certain temperatures, it's likely to combust and catch fire. These materials can be corrosive, so they can eat their way through the plastic lining in these landfills. It can be reactive. So depending on what it comes in contact with, this can be very dangerous. And many of these are simply just toxic to either humans or other plants or animals in the environment. So all of these are categories of hazardous waste that cannot simply be thrown away. Most of this type of waste is produced industrially, but we do have many forms that find their way into our homes as well. So things like paints, batteries, oil, different solvents, cleaning agents, lubricants, pesticides, all of these things you can't just simply throw away. These need to be disposed of in a very particular way. So don't throw away those batteries. put them off to the side, keep them in a little bin, and make sure they get to make sure they are disposed of properly so they don't make their way into the normal landfill. And these industries that are producing large amounts of hazardous waste are required by law to report their waste to the EPA. So they need to report the type of waste, the amount they're generating, its location, where it's going. They need to monitor how this waste is handled because, again, this waste can become dangerous if it's not disposed of properly. Unfortunately, because of this, because in many cases, corporations need to hire outside companies to help them deal with this hazardous waste, this can be pretty costly. So in order to cut costs, many companies dispose of their hazardous waste illegally, either by dumping it or more commonly, simply exporting it outside of the country, sort of thinking of it as out of sight, out of mind. But then wherever this hazardous waste is exported, these developing countries then need to deal with it. Many of these countries don't have the infrastructure to do so, so this becomes a huge problem. When it comes to disposing of this type of waste, we can do this in a few different ways. The two most common are surface impoundments, where we create these sort of large pools that are lined with plastic or some sort of material that is not going to be degraded by the hazardous waste. So we store the liquid waste in these large pools, let the water evaporate, which eventually leaves a solid residue that we can then scrape up, transport somewhere else, and dispose of it in a more permanent fashion. We also use what we call deep well injections. And a deep well injection is when we take that hazardous waste and we drill deep, deep, deep down, way past the water table into the ground and inject our waste way down below. So here is a diagram explaining how this process works. Obviously, this poses a lot of risks because we have this deep well that we're drilling down. We have to make sure we're going past all of the groundwater here, because if we have any fault in our well here, we could risk contamination into these aquifers, which could result in contamination of things like drinking water or the surrounding ecosystem. So we have to make sure that these are very structurally sound. They're not placed in any area that might be prone to things like earthquakes, because if we have a break in our well here, we risk contamination into the surrounding rock, soil, and aquifers. So this is what we do with a lot of our liquid hazardous waste, or that solid hazardous waste that we can't simply put into a landfill. One form of hazardous waste that has grown a ton in the last 30 years or so is electronic waste. Electronic waste is waste that is things like obsolete computers, old cell phones, old iPods, MP3 players, any of those old electronic devices. These actually contain trace amounts of hazardous metals that can, once they begin to break down in the environment, leach into the substrate and cause contamination. And our e-waste has grown so substantially, primarily because many of these products have a very short lifespan. We've all, at this point, probably gone through many different cell phones. So if you think of the buildup, when we expand that across the world, there is a ton of e-waste that we generate every year. So what I'm going to leave you with here is a video that is going to talk a little bit more about the generation of e-waste.
You buy a new smartphone or computer and you take your old one to a local recycler. It's the green thing to do, right? Well, it turns out a lot of those devices may not be getting recycled at all. From Seattle, member station KCTS and public media's environmental partnership EarthFix, Ken Christensen and Katie Campbell, who tells the story, follow the e-waste trail.
So everybody, this is scenario one. We're buying equipment. We look around, see what they have, and we start haggling over the price. So any questions?
No, sir.
I think it's right up here, about a quarter of a mile.
Jim Puckett is leading a team that's going undercover to find out what actually happens to electronics that are sent to U.S. recyclers.
Most of the public still thinks a recycler is a recycler and that they're going to recycle it right there in America.
Shows us 10 meters out.
Puckett is the founder of the Basel Action Network, a Seattle-based watchdog group that investigates the afterlife of electronics.
We're basically trying to stop the rich countries from dumping their hazardous waste on the poorer countries.
In this case, China.
But they're running. Running away?
To get inside, a local driver and translator posed as e-waste buyers.
Hello, we're here to buy goods. We just want to see the electronics.
With people buying new computers and other electronics more frequently than ever, electronic waste is now the fastest growing waste stream in the world. On top of that, it contains toxic materials that can poison people and the environment. This investigation began months ago, when Puckett's team put GPS tracking devices inside 200 old computers, printers, and TVs. Then they dropped them off at locations across the country, at recycling facilities, donation centers, and electronics take-back programs, including some of the industry's most reputable companies.
We sat back and said, where are they going to go? And the little devices went out and spoke to us, saying, this is where I am.
Puckett's group partnered with Carlo Roddi of the Sensible City Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
Tracking is really the first step in order to design a better system. One of the surprising things we discover is how far waste travels. You see these kind of global e-waste flows that actually almost cover the whole planet.
Each device traveled an average of about 2,500 miles, and around a third of the tracked computers were exported. Of those, most ended up here. Hong Kong is home to one of the world's busiest ports. Ships deliver more cargo than is possible to inspect. As a result, Hong Kong has a reputation for being a transit point for illegal trade and smuggling of all kinds.
Turn right onto Tin Fung Road.
Most of the exported tracked devices led Puckett to a little-known part of Hong Kong called the New Territories.
It's really a frontier. It's really cowboy land out there.
Puckett followed one tracked printer here to a place that calls itself a farm.
Farmland.
Farmland? Yeah, that's a great farm in there. You would have no idea that there was a huge scrapyard there until you look over the fence.
Inside, they found printers being taken apart by immigrant workers.
I'm looking for asset tags to tell me where the material came from. I look for the environmental harm issues. I look for the workstations to see how those workers might be exposed.
Many of the workers handle hazardous material without protective gear. One concern, printer toner, a probable carcinogen.
There's no protections of this labor force. There's no occupational laws that are going to protect them.
Jackson Lau is the head of the Hong Kong Recycling Association. He runs a licensed recycling facility in the New Territories, and he says the junkyards in the area that import e-waste are unlicensed and unregulated.
These old electronics are usually being sorted and dismantled because the leftover components are worthless. They're being dumped indiscriminately.
Look at the tubes, many tubes thrown on the ground here.
The white fluorescent tubes light up LCD screens. Each of them contains mercury, and even a tiny amount can be a neurotoxin.
Day in and day out, these workers are completely oblivious to this hazard, are smashing these. The tubes are breaking right in front of their faces, and mercury is very toxic.
Do you wear a mask?
No.
I asked him that if he knows the white tubes are dangerous,
He has no idea. The United States is the only developed nation that hasn't ratified an international treaty to stop first world countries from dumping e-waste on developing nations. Other developed nations set e-waste collection mandates and require electronics manufacturers to pay for domestic e-waste processing. Further, the United States has no federal laws requiring electronics to be recycled. Half of states allow electronics to be dumped in landfills. John Shigarian is the CEO of Electronics Recycling International, the largest e-waste recycling company in the United States.
It takes hundreds of employees in each facility to do the real work of electronic recycling.
He says that some recyclers are exporting to cut costs because in the last 2 years, their biggest source of revenue has plummeted.
At the height of the market, when we would go to sell steel, plastic, aluminum, gold, silver, palladium, copper, we were getting 14 to 15 cents a pound more than we are today.
Dell Reconnect, an exciting program that makes getting rid of old technology easy.
Dell was the first major computer manufacturer to ban the export of non-working electronics to developing countries. They partnered with Goodwill, allowing people to drop off old computers of any brand for free to be refurbished or recycled. The electronics are either dismantled on site or sent to Dell's recycling partners. Dell says that more than 400 million pounds of e-waste has been diverted from U.S. landfills because of their program. But the Basel Action Network and MIT's investigation concluded that tracking devices placed in old computers and dropped off at participating Goodwill locations ended up in Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, and Thailand. Beth Johnson manages Dell's program.
If there's something that did not follow the system, we would certainly want to know about it, and we would certainly take corrective action.
In a written statement, Goodwill Industries said it's committed to responsible recycling and encouraged its member organizations, which are autonomous, to review their contracts with Dell. Back in Hong Kong, Puckett finds more clues to the scale of the problem.
Laptop with an LCD screen ending up here in Hong Kong and new territories for the Los Angeles school system. Unbelievable.
Puckett finds electronics from U.S. police departments, jails, hospitals, and libraries.
The government is always trying to save taxpayers' money, so they are obliged in some cases to always do the cheapest thing.
For now, market forces are driving e-waste exports.
Just throwing it on the bank here.
Without a federal law banning the export of e-waste, there's little incentive for the industry to change. For KCTS and the PBS NewsHour, I'm Katie Campbell.
All right. So hopefully that's it's informative to you. You know a little bit more about what happens to all the waste we are generating here. Obviously, we do not have a perfect system. A lot of changes need to be made in order to better handle the waste, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. That is all we have, though, lecture-wise before your final on the 28th. So keep an eye out on your email because I will be sending updates on how our final is going to work. It's going to work a lot like our last exam did, so that I will make sure to put up a, I'll let you know how that is going to function by the end of the week here. I will also post a quiz that goes along with this lecture on Thursday, so keep a lookout for that. And again, any groups that have yet to present, it looks like at this point, the remaining groups are going to be presenting on the 28th. Those that have responded to my doodle polls, thank you. Those of you that have not, please make sure you do that. As of now, though, it looks like all the remaining groups have chosen the 28th to present, so I will be sending out emails with more information on that as well. Thank you all, and I will talk to you later.